Order. Stephen Gettins to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Can I also thank colleagues for turning out for today's debate as well. Mr. Chair, we're now on the 10th anniversary of the vote to leave the European Union. A lost decade for the economy, a lost decade for business, and a lost decade for future generations, and in particular our young people, that has left us poorer, more isolated and less secure in a changing world. And I note, and I'm grateful again to colleagues for all turning up today, I note that those of us who seek to debate, to discuss this issue, are those of us who want a closer relationship with the European Union. I say overwhelmingly those of us who want a closer relationship with the European Union, because bluntly, we know it's been a disaster. Nobody's arguing that leaving the EU has been a good idea. Nobody's arguing that leaving the EU has left us any wealthier. Nobody's arguing that leaving the EU has made us better off. And in fact, no other state has sought to leave the European Union since the Brexit debacle unfolded. This kind of isolationism, this kind of exceptionalism, is something that we must reflect upon very, very seriously indeed. And I know the government is, but we have a number of specific questions for the government. But I want to reflect for a moment, I want to reflect for a moment that when we talk about looking at this, that no other state has sought to leave, and I have made the member aware that I will be referencing him today in this one instance. Nigel Farage told us the UK will not be the last member to leave. No one left and more members are seeking to join. That's been the legacy of this period. Now, are there any colleagues from Reform today? None. Now there are some from the Conservatives, and I can never quite tell who's in and who's out and which way round they are, so I'm never quite sure. So just to be clear, but there are no members from Reform in what is the showcase policy platform that they have. This is an isolationist, nationalist project, and it has failed, and failed profoundly. And on that point, I'm going to give way to Mr Sheridan, because he's always very courteous in the chamber.
Okay, very kind. Thank you very much. And the honourable gentleman and I have a very different opinion in relation to Brexit, but does he, in relation to legacy, he mentioned legacy, the legacy for us from Northern Ireland is we're half in, we're half out, and we don't get, our businesses suffer, our exports suffer, our imports suffer, our people suffer. Now, I know the honourable gentleman will have a different opinion in relation to it, but does he not agree that Northern Ireland didn't get the Brexit that everybody else got, which we wanted?
Well, it certainly didn't get the Brexit it voted for, because, of course, the people of Northern Ireland voted overwhelmingly to reject it. And no wonder, a Brexit that undermined the peace process. But don't worry, Mr Gove, who's not in this place, so I don't need to reference him, told Northern Ireland it was going to get the best of both worlds. Well, if only we'd all had the best of both worlds. I don't take too many interventions, but I think I've taken Mr Sheridan. I should take a viewpoint from Shannon. I think I should take a viewpoint from the majority point of view in Northern Ireland as well.
Yes, indeed. I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I would just like to remind colleagues that Northern Ireland actually did vote to remain, and it is regretful that Northern Ireland has been the brunt in all of this. I don't spend my time relitigating Brexit because it tore my country apart. But today, our community and voluntary sector in Northern Ireland, the legacy is that we have never had those European social funds replaced like for like by any government since we left the EU, and that is a disgraceful legacy.
Do you know, I want to thank the member for a powerful point, the powerful case and the respectful case in which she makes her case regularly. Northern Ireland, I was in this place at the time, Northern Ireland was overlooked, consecutively overlooked, its views disregarded. Now, members will forgive me, I'm going to try and make some progress, but I think it was incredibly important that the first two interventions, although from different sides, were from Northern Ireland, far too often overlooked in this place, and the peace process coming as a price that others thought was far too worth paying than it should have been. But let me talk about the economy. National Bureau of Economic Research shows 90 billion lost in tax revenues. 90 billion. £250 million every day. That means wasted, not taken by the tax, every 48 hours is enough as the entire annual budget for the City Council of the City of Dundee, part of which I represent. Every 48 hours wasted. Investment is lower than it would have been. And even despite that, the UK paid out billions for the privilege of putting itself into this ludicrous situation. And more seriously, SMEs who grow our economy, who employ so many people, have found it harder to grow. Households where the cost of living has increased at a time when they can ill afford it. And the government knows this and knows how serious it is for households. And trade deals that we knew would do nothing to compensate for the loss and continue to do nothing to compensate for the loss. But there's a human element. The opportunities for young people. As politicians, all of us should be in a place where we leave more opportunities for the generations who come after than we ourselves enjoyed. Yet this place leaves fewer opportunities for those who came before us. Now, I was somebody whose life was transformed by doing Erasmus at the University of Dundee. I'm glad that the government has belatedly come round to reintroducing it. Belatedly. But there's been a lost generation of those who never had it and who also no longer have freedom of movement. Freedom of movement that allows our young people to live and work. And I wonder if anybody can tell me, and the Minister can tell me, why on earth do you think there was such an explosion in those seeking second passports? Those seeking passports because they had Polish ancestry, French ancestry, or in my own case, my family members who had Irish family. Why on earth has that grown? And if the member can tell me that, I'd welcome the member's intervention.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's very generous. And on that point, does he not agree it's totally unfair that one person in my constituency missed out on their gap year and travelling abroad because they have a British passport, and their friend got to travel, got that experience because they were able to access an Irish passport?
I absolutely agree. And you see, that's the benefit of Ireland being a member of the European Union, and why I cannot fathom why the Conservatives, I can understand that, reform, but why Labour, and I'm sorry to say the Liberal Democrats, do not endorse rejoining the European Union. It's staring them in the face. But I'll give way on that point. Go on.
I do tire sometimes of the honourable member. I thank him for giving me, but the honourable member's party in Scotland making this fuss about us not wanting to rejoin. If he looks back, he'll see that the Liberal Democrats were the ones who desperately wanted not to leave. We campaigned for a second referendum. We want to create a new customs union. We desperately want to be closer to Europe. So please, would the honourable member kindly give the correct picture of the Liberal Democrat position?
The correct picture is that let's talk about the presence. Do the Liberal Democrats want to rejoin the EU right now? My party does. Do you? I'll give way again. Yes or no?
If the honourable member can explain the contradiction between wanting to join one union and give up sovereignty and wanting to leave another.
And the honourable member has fallen into the nationalist exceptional trap that I was more expected of the Conservatives or Reform. Why is it that 27 member states of the European Union consider themselves independent and sovereign in the European Union? The European Union is a club for independent states. The UK is not. And that is the fundamental difference. And I'm going to talk about migration briefly. I'm going to talk about migration very briefly, because this is important. And I want to make some progress. A lot of people want to get in. The UK left the Dublin regulation, which led to an explosion in the small boats, the Brexit boats, the reform boats, the Tory boats, if you like. In the EU, irregular border crossings have gone down. In the UK, they have gone up. Now, I know the government's looking at some of these returns, but that is a desperate situation. The impact on devolution. Scotland voted to leave, but even within the deal, we have the Internal Market Act, and I hope the Minister will revisit the Internal Market Act, one that Labour cried out about previously, but the current one, the Scottish Parliament refused consent. We've talked about Northern Ireland, and because we don't have the purest of pure Brexits, now the ECHR is under threat. It's a bit like the purest of pure communism's apparently never been tried. The purest of pure Brexits for the ultimate Brexiteers has never been tried either. So that threat that we have in terms of devolution, which continues under the Internal Market Act, and I hope the Minister will address that in his comments. And finally, we're less secure. Today it's 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I know we're all in the same place on this. Something that turned the whole of Europe upside down. The EU is integral to our security. So will the Minister tell me why Canada can join the defence procurement scheme, but the UK cannot, and what progress is being made by that? Because that is a fundamentally important issue. And let me just make one more, and I'll take an intervention from the Labour Party. We have the points of food and energy security. Ukraine, Moldova and others see their future in Europe. And why on earth doesn't the UK? 80% of our young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, want to rejoin. Not customs union, they want to rejoin. 75% of Scots want to rejoin, because this has been a failure. And he's made, I'm going to take the member for Nahalin and Inyar, so at the moment.
Nobody can doubt the member for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry's Europhile credentials, but I do doubt his party's commitment to unions of any kind. Why else can he tell me that the SNP spent more fighting a by-election in Shetland than it did fighting the Brexit referendum? And when he's finished answering that, perhaps he can tell us why his party spent more fighting the Glenrothes by-election than it did fighting Brexit.
I'm glad he raised this. So in Scotland, where we campaigned and overwhelmingly voted to remain in the UK, a vote that was ignored by his party, that was ignored by this place as an anti-democratic process in terms of Scotland, and on that point in terms of how much campaigning was done. The Brexit referendum took place 6 weeks after the Scottish, Welsh, London elections. Now, at the time, in order to make that campaigning period longer, I put down an amendment to the bill so that we had a longer period to campaign in it. So we could spend more money, we could campaign more, we could make the case more. And his party rejected it. They walked into the lobbies, as they often do, with the Conservative Party to reject that amendment that I put down. I put down an amendment so that 16-year-olds could vote as they do in Scotland. His party rejected it. The only one they endorsed, and I'm glad they did, was that for European nationals to have the vote. And that one was accepted. So throughout the process, we sought to amend the damage that his party had done under under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader at the time. Who's he? Who's he, says. He was your leader over 2 general elections. So finally, and I know, Mr Chair, a number of people to come in, Brexit's failed. Those who spoke of democracy have often since taken their seats in the House of Lords at the same time, never having to face the electorate ever again. We even have limitations on discussing and debating the head of state, as has been happening today, in fairness with the Liberal Democrat motion that's going on today. And those who bewail the chaos and failure of the past decade that's seen us run through 6 British Prime Ministers, soon to be a 7th, apparently, 7 British Prime Ministers soon to be, if the leader of the Scottish Labour Party has their own way, talk about the chaos that has enveloped the UK since the Brexit referendum. Please reflect on where this is. We need to rejoin. Anything that brings us closer to the EU, I will endorse, but we know that everything is simply less bad. Mr Chair, enough is enough. 10 years on. 10 years on. Can we have, I'm about to listen to all these members make the case for Europe. Can I say to Liberal members, Tory members, Labour members in particular, have the courage of your convictions and get us closer to Europe, get us rejoining Europe and stop damaging the UK. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the impact of the 2016 EU membership referendum on the United Kingdom. There will be a 2-minute limit on speeches. I will call the wind-ups at 4:15. 4:05, sorry. Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Sir Deputy.
Pleasure to speak with you in the chair, and I commend the honourable gentleman. I have to say there's a thirst for discussing this in this chamber, apart from the Shadow Minister's side, who looks rather lonely in his position. I have to say Cambridge was one of the most pro-Remain areas in the UK. The Market Ward in central Cambridge, the highest Remain vote anywhere in the country, and I'm proud of that. I shared that view with a passion, and I have to say that early morning of June the 24th, 2016, in Chelmsford, in an empty sports centre where the votes were being put together in eastern England, was one of the lowest points of my political life. But I accept that the vote in 2016 was lost. I think the years that have followed have cost us dear. In the science and research field, we've clawed our way back into Horizon, but look at the damage done. Relationships broken, ground lost, it will take years to rebuild. And I'm thrilled that it's this government that will return us to the Erasmus scheme that's done so much, as the honourable gentleman said, to enrich so many lives, but again, years lost. As a food minister, I saw directly the problems that so many of our brilliant food producers have faced getting their products to European customers. All those export health certificates that had to be completed, which is why I'm so pleased that this government that's doing the long, hard, painstaking work to build a new SPS agreement. Let me finish this brief contribution on that positive note. If that day in Chelmsford was a low point, the agreement of that SPS process last year was one of the high points. As Food Minister, I was privileged to be with a number of major food companies in the Downing Street garden celebrating that occasion. Pieces of cake with EU and UK flags. A joy to see, a sight that would bring joy to so many of my Cambridge constituents who are passionate Europeans. So yes, a decade lost, but we're now on the right path.
Yeah. Jim Allister.
Sir Desmond, I suppose one should be timid about entering this echo chamber of Remainers and Remoaners, but here I am. And of course, the first thing that strikes one is the utter disrespect for the largest democratic vote ever in the history of this nation. To the many in this place, it is a nothing, it is to be swept aside. Well, I say to you, if you're Democrats, shame on you in that regard. But I must say I am intrigued by the approach of the Scottish National Party. This is a party whose raison d'etre is to have a sovereign, independent Scotland. But as soon as they get it, they want to hand away their sovereignty. They want to hand away their independence. They want to subjugate it to the sovereignty of a foreign EU. And no doubt they want to build a Hadrian's Wall international customs border, because if they join the EU and the rest of the United Kingdom doesn't, then that's what they're going to have. And from the experience of Northern Ireland, let me tell them what that means. That means that your supply goods from your main market in GB will be subject to international customs declarations, to international tariffs, to paperwork, to extra costs. And that's what this independence-seeking SNP thinks is the recipe for the future. And of course, we've had much propaganda today about the failures allegedly of Brexit. Yes, it has failed where it hasn't been given, and that's in Northern Ireland. But if you take, for example, manufacturing, which is probably the most affected by Brexit, isn't it strange that the UK's productivity performance in manufacturing has been the strongest of any country in the G7? And thank you.
Chair today, and I thank the honourable member for his powerful speech in opening this debate. In June 2016, my constituents voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union, following a campaign in which I and my team had worked as hard as we have in any election where my name was on the ballot paper. For the vast majority of residents in Dulwich and West Norwood, the UK's membership of the European Union and consequently their status as both British and European citizens was fundamental to their identity, and its loss, particularly by such a narrow margin, was viscerally felt. It has turned out that the loss was much greater than the replacement of our burgundy passports with navy blue ones. During the campaign, we consistently raised our evidence-based concerns that Brexit would harm our country. We were accused of scaremongering, but on every single one of the issues on which we campaigned, the passage of time has proved us right.
Will my honourable friend please give way? I thank my honourable friend for giving way. The National Bureau of Economic Research has also said that because of Brexit, the economy is 6 to 8% smaller than it otherwise would be. And the first Black Country Chamber of Commerce meeting that I went to, most of the businesses there were talking about the adverse effects of Brexit. But would my honourable friend agree that the step forward now is to carry on, is to make the most of the agreement that this government has made with the European Union with a view to growing the economy and backing British jobs?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He is indeed right. The OBR is clear that Brexit has caused a 4% long-term reduction in GDP and has created a structural challenge in UK manufacturing. The export of UK goods to the EU has fallen by 27%, imports by 32%. I won't give way because of the numbers of members who wish to speak. 16,400 SMEs have given up exporting to the EU because of Brexit-related red tape. I'm not going to give way because of the numbers of colleagues who wish to get in. Our food is more expensive. Regulation has dropped, and there was no £350 million a week for the NHS. I took the view during the debates that followed the referendum that I would prioritise representing my constituents' views, that on such an important matter, even if we were losing the argument, democratic representation and plurality of voices mattered. It led me to rebel on a number of votes and to resign from the shadow front bench in order not to vote in support of the Conservatives' Brexit deal. Brexit drove a huge wedge through the middle of our country. It divided regions from each other, split communities and even families, according to strong and sincerely held views. We do not need to relitigate those arguments, and we do not need to keep telling each other that we were wrong or seeking to convince ourselves that we can easily return to where we were. But responsible government demands that we reckon with the reality that we find ourselves in. We must acknowledge the immense harm that has been done, that we are poorer and less secure as a consequence of Brexit, and it is right that we seek to undo the damage. So I welcome the steps that the government has taken already to reset our relationship with the European Union, starting with re-establishing the warmth of our friendship, reopening regular and constructive dialogue, negotiating new deals and rejoining Erasmus+. There is further to go, but we must move forward step by step, making the consensus, building community and connection, and moving forward in a realistic way, recognising that relationships are mutual, not unilateral, and there is more to do to rebuild our relationship.
Alison Bennett. Carry on. Carry on.
Thank you,
Honourable Lady.
It's a pleasure to serve under your. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I thank the honourable member for securing this important debate. In South Cambridgeshire, the majority, 60.2% of constituencies, voted to remain in the European Union. They did so from a clear understanding that our prosperity, freedoms and security depend on and benefit from cooperation with our closest neighbours. But the effects of the Brexit referendum deal have been stark and deeply damaging. For our young people, they've lost their freedoms that we as their parents once took for granted. The right to travel, work, study, live and love across the EU. Economically, it's blown a 90 billion-year hole in the public finances. Around 250 million every single day in lost tax revenue. And an economy now between 6 and 8% smaller than if we had not left, particularly hitting our small and medium businesses. There are wider issues of security too. As Dr. Paul Brown, Chair of Cambridge for Europe, said, the world of 2026 is not the world of 2016. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine shows us that democracy, defence and economic security are one. And after a decade of working internationally with communities and economies devastated by climate change, I became much more politically active when I realised that Brexit would threaten our environment. Nature knows no borders. Wildlife mates and nests in one country whilst feeding in another. And the Habitats and Water Framework directives were hugely effective in respecting that. However, we're now diverging from those protections of the nature and wildlife we all hold so dear. The Institute for European Environmental Policy has found that since Brexit, the EU has introduced 28 new or strengthened pieces of environmental legislation that the UK has not adopted. Meanwhile, we have weakened protections in areas such as habitats, pesticides, forever chemicals and fisheries. We must be bolder, rejoin closer to the EU and thank you.
serve under your chairship. I was going to talk about business and trade and many other factors, but let me just focus my remarks on young people. When I go to schools and speak to young people across Beckenham and Penge, the impact on them has been significant. The young people in my constituency and across the country continue to face the brunt of such a consequential decision that they had no say in whatsoever. In January last year, YouGov found that over 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds thought Brexit was a mistake. And behind those percentages and numbers are real people whose aspirations and ambitions are being held back. This week, I will.
I wondered if he finds it bizarre that at the moment, if you're a British citizen, you can only spend 90 days out of every 180 in Europe. Yet, reciprocally, if you're an EU national, you can spend 6 months in the UK. And I wondered if he thought that at the next EU-UK summit, we could pursue a reciprocal visa travel arrangement.
I think that's something the government is looking at, and I'd welcome the Minister's response on it when he responds. But I've had the pleasure this week of being joined by 2 university students, Zoe and Isaac, from Beckenham and Penge, who are in the public gallery today. And I asked them what this has meant for them in practical terms. Zoe said that though her course offers a year abroad, something she's always wanted to do, it's now implausible for her to go because of how expensive it's become with increased mobility costs, visa and administrative costs. And Isaac, likewise, would like to study in the EU after he graduates or work abroad, but current restrictions mean that is unlikely for him to be able to do so. I therefore welcome steps by this government to address some of these issues through plans to rejoin the Erasmus scheme in 2027, or indeed through the EU-UK Youth Mobility Scheme, which would give those aged 18 to 35 the chance to study and work for up to 4 years abroad. And I'd welcome the Minister's response, when he makes his response, to tell us how quickly that will be rolled out.
Rosie Duffield.
To serve under your chairship today, and thank you to the member for our brave for securing the debate. Almost a decade since we held that fateful referendum, let's look back and count the many and varied so-called Brexit benefits some promised us. As we bask in the glorious position the UK now enjoys on the world stage, admired and envied by those nations that remain tethered to that huge cooperative trading bloc with equal standards, the paperless flow of goods, shorter passport queues and easier travel, investment, infrastructure, tourism, shared intelligence, movement for students and those in shortage occupations, shared research and development, art and music projects. The stark reality, 10 years on from the infamous and baseless bus slogans, is not really freedom at all. Not for those of us whose constituencies have so many ties with our continental neighbours, ties that go back centuries, ties that are embedded in this nation's social, political, industrial, legal, creative and academic history. My constituency's very soul, our magnificent cathedral, our heritage, our people, our institutions are not only British but European. We're practically joined to France, and a few days ago we welcomed the French ambassador and other dignitaries to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Channel Tunnel Treaty signed by Mrs Thatcher and President Mitterrand in a cathedral built mostly of French stone. Kent is essentially Britain's front door to European travellers. Thankfully, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it will always be a thriving and popular destination, but that is despite Brexit. And our easy relationship with the neighbours who could just pop over from next door has changed dramatically. Our economy is based on tourism, agriculture, produce and that trading relationship. Whitstable oysters supply French restaurants, but this once seamless transaction involved 72 pieces of paper and multiple checks after Brexit. Our farms and local food businesses...
A rather dreary February, and despite looking quite hard, I haven't been able to see any of the rainbows or unicorns which we were promised during the debate of the Brexit days, or the millions promised to the NHS, and that's what we were promised. However, let's be realistic and let's build our hopes for the future. As the member for Beckenham and Penge has mentioned, young people, and of course the vast majority of this House would agree what we want is collaboration, shared security, shared prosperity and more jobs. What we need to talk about are the social and cultural consequences of the UK's departure from the European Union, and we need economic common sense. The government's already made great progress in resetting the relationship with the EU after the Tory years of chaos.
On that point,
of course.
I thank
my honourable friend for giving way. On that point, I worked in a retail head office at the time of Brexit in buying. It was an extremely uncertain time, and I remember having to stay up quite literally all night to figure out how we were going to move stock from the EU into the UK to protect sales ahead of Black Friday. Does she agree with me that the EU-UK reset is a real opportunity to offer certainty to businesses who the Conservative Party let down in that time?
The member for Kettering knows of what she speaks in the whole area of trade with the EU and manufacturing in the UK. And the new UK-EU partnership does include an agreement to work towards making agri-food trade easier, as the member for Cambridge mentioned, and ultimately the SPS deal will add $9 billion to the UK economy in the long term. But we do need to get on with it. We've 18 months into this Parliament, we need to put our foot onto the accelerator, fighting against food poverty, bringing down food prices and helping manufacturers. On creative industries, I would also like to emphasise that there's so much more we can do to support our creative sector. We need specific commitments on touring to allow artists to travel visa-free, to carry their instruments, equipment and props without prohibitive admin and bureaucracy. A special cultural exemption from the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, would go a long way to that, and I know that that's at the heart of the discussions for the Cabinet Secretary. Now, of course I will.
I'm very grateful to the lady for giving way. She mentions the EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which of course is meant to remove tariffs. But would she share my concern about companies such as those in Taunton and Wellington, who, whilst not having to pay tariffs for every transaction across border, have to pay £300 to have all the paperwork done, effectively a tariff, not the free trade we are promised? Doesn't it show the lunacy of the way the Brexit decision came out?
The honourable member is completely right that there's far too much unnecessary bureaucracy which didn't exist before, and really if we can develop the relationship with European partners, those creases can be ironed out and we can have a much more friction-free trade. Finally, to realise our full potential on tackling global challenges such as climate change, the UK needs to play a fuller part in the latest iteration of the EU's Research and Innovation Programme, FP10, as we did in Horizon Europe 2024, and I would welcome an update from the Minister on that point. To sum up, nothing says more about who we are and our place in the world than our relationship with our closest neighbours. The new UK-EU strategic partnership is a great start, but there's lots more to do. Let's not waste this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Sir Desmond.
80 years ago, just after the Second World War, my great-uncle Zelia stood outside this Parliament building and he doffed his hat, everyone had a hat in those days, and he said, "She saved us all." He was a Latvian Jew, he lived in Paris, and I was always told he'd fought with the French resistance. And he certainly knew what Britain had meant to Europe. The whole of Europe knew that, and at that moment, Europe looked to Britain for a lead. But we pulled back. And even when we finally joined them, we developed the habit of blaming Brussels more than reminding people of the benefits. So when the 2016 referendum came, people answered on the basis of what they'd been told and what they hadn't been told. And now 10 years on, as we're talking about, 10 years on, the cost is clear. Boris Johnson promised the NHS £19 billion a year. Instead, we have lost £90 billion a year, every year, in tax revenue.
Will you give way on that point?
I'll gladly give way.
I thank my honourable friend and colleague for giving way at that point. My predecessor, Boris Johnson, promised much which never seemed to materialise locally as well as nationally. But he's right in his assertion that economically we've seen significant impacts. Pharmaceutical companies in my own constituency talk about double administration, double testing of exports of drugs now, the need to go through both the European and the UK medicines agencies for approvals. And they've said that this has directly harmed investment and jobs in the UK. Does he share my concern about this issue?
I do indeed, and I congratulate my honourable friend again for replacing Boris Johnson with a much nicer man whose hair's definitely a lot better than his. I absolutely agree, and I think that we have to recognise that the swiftest path to growth for this country lies in tackling the red tape that Brexit introduced. I think of in my own constituency of Chelsea and Fulham, a small butcher who used to import most of his goods from Spain and Italy and now has shelves half bare because his small distributors just can't cope with the paperwork. So we don't have this £90 billion anymore in tax revenue, and it's money that we need so badly for our NHS, for our police and our schools after years of Conservative austerity. Now, I'm not dismissing the concerns that drove the Leave vote, least of all the feeling of not being heard, but the response that the referendum conveys has made all of these problems worse. If they voted to take back control, if we left to take back control, the evidence simply is that we have much less of this. So no wonder we have 2/3 of the British people, including 6 out of 10 of those who voted Leave, who now say they want a closer relationship with the European Union, as my government is pursuing. The British people deserve better. This country, diminished though it is, yes, but still undefeated, has never shrunk from doing what the moment requires. So let us seize this moment to repair the damage, to welcome the reset, to act with ambition and optimism and hope, and put Brexit right.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Mr. Swain, I never inhaled. I always opposed Brexit, and I continue to fight for a closer relationship with Europe. I also recognise the way in which the previous government left the European Union was the hardest of Brexits. They compounded the damage that walking out of the room has done to this country. And we see it now in our constituencies every single day. I do not believe that anybody voted for 1.8 million fewer jobs to be created in our economy, for 16,000 businesses to give up on trading with Europe because the basic consequence of Brexit was paperwork. I do not believe that anybody in this country really wanted those outcomes. But I also recognise, I apologise, I recognise the time, that 2016 was over a decade ago. And one of the challenges in this nation is that we've always acted as if the hard part about our relationship with Europe was us deciding what we want to happen, and the easy part was going and telling our European counterparts what we wanted to do. In a decade in which President Trump has been elected twice, COVID has happened, the Me Too movement occurred, TikTok was invented, let alone the antics of President Putin. If we are going to get this right, the Honourable Gentleman is right to argue that we need to get closer to Europe, but we have to show them the respect to recognise the damage that we did in walking out of the door in what we ask now. We need a salvage operation, first and foremost, for British business, British jobs, British climate, British people. That requires looking at the deal that's been done with Switzerland. We must get closer to the single market. The customs union detracts our European counterparts and European freedom of movement. There is so much more that we can do. But first, let's start by respecting those people we disavowed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your term and thank the member for bringing the debate today. I just simply wanted to say I watched for years afar as a normal member of the public in Northern Ireland as this place discussed me and my family and my country's future. And I really meant it at the start whenever I said Brexit tore my country apart, because it did. I stand here today as the only elected member from Northern Ireland that is neither nationalist or unionist, and I am really proud of that, and I'm really proud of that decision that Lagan Valley made. No doubt others may later say that I am simply a nationalist. I am simply just a vehicle for a populist argument. I find that really denigrating, because actually Northern Ireland did vote to remain, but that was across unionist people, nationalist people, and people like me who are neither of those things. Whilst we'll hear that there are issues with the protocol, of course there are. I sit in Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, we discuss it regularly. I put down written questions regularly. I didn't want to leave because I'm British, I'm Irish, I'm Northern Irish, and I'm European. And I will never choose. Do not make me choose. But that is what this did. It ripped away that umbrella of identity, and members Northern Ireland has never recovered. Others simply won't let it. But the truth be told, that it was such a great burden for so many that I'm not sure what the way forward is. Others threw out simple referendums as the cure to it all. I don't believe that, actually. I don't believe others throwing out simple referendums about a united Ireland as the cure. I don't believe that either. I do believe that we have to have something that the UK as a whole, as other members have suggested today, that we simply need to get closer. But I just wanted to say that it broke my heart and many others' hearts, and it caused great unrest and strife. Many of us in Northern Ireland are recovering.
From the referendum about the economic impacts of the Conservative Brexit deal. And I won't spend too much time discussing that, other than to say that it comes up every time I knock on a door in Reading that belongs to a small medium enterprise owner whose exports have fallen across the UK by almost a third since Brexit. We are now bearing the costs of that. No, thank you. But there is lots we can now do to mitigate the costs of Brexit on our residents, including securing a sanitary and phytosanitary and veterinary agreement with the EU, and I asked the Minister to give an update on the progress of that. Working with colleagues in the Living Standards Coalition of MPs, we found that this could reduce EU food import prices by between 3 to 6% in the next few years, which will be a substantial amount to take the cost of living off our residents. But in order to move forward, we have to look at where we are now and see how the world sees us. In my previous job, when I was reporting on trade from Brussels, as a British journalist for a British newspaper, I would often attract wry comments from other members of the European Commission and community about my nationality and the choices that my country had made. During those years around the Brexit negotiations, we had 5 foreign secretaries and 6 business secretaries, so no wonder they had some comments about my government. Contrast that with the reception that our Prime Minister had at the Munich Security Conference, where I was in the audience and heard the spontaneous applause when the Prime Minister declared that we are no longer the Britain of the Brexit years anymore. That we must build a stronger Europe and a more European NATO, and that there is no British security without Europe and no European security without Britain. Now, that security does not just mean defence, it means food, it means energy, climate and the environment. And I'm proud that in my constituency we have one of the last remaining European institutions headquartered in the UK, the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, which will build on its new site and soon will raise its British flag alongside the flags of all its partners.
Yeah. Thank you, Sir Desmond. I do want to thank the member for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry for the way in which he introduced the debate. He did forget, though, in his recollections, that we could have had a customs union if he hadn't stayed along with his 35 SNP colleagues. That's a simple fact, and perhaps he can address that in his summing up. One of the challenges we face as a country is so many people in the UK feel left behind. They feel the impact of the banking crisis and also of COVID still. Both things which are once in a lifetime but are being exaggerated and amplified by Brexit. The Brexiteers told us that all we needed to do to set our country on a wealthier path was to get rid of the Europeans. And I have to say it's very similar to the argument we hear about Donald Trump and Mexicans, and also the argument we hear about the SNP and getting rid of the rest of the UK. All three are wrong for exactly the same reasons. Now the same Brexiteers tell us that all we have to do to set our country on a wealthier path is to get rid of immigrants, to other them. Again, this is not correct, particularly when we remember we have 350,000 immigrants working in our NHS. We all know the route to prosperity is to work closer with our biggest trading partners, and for us that is the European Union. And I'm proud that this government has taken us in that direction. I do hope that one day when you join the EU, but I do recognise, as others have hinted, that that has to become before a manifesto commitment and a referendum, not something that any of us want to rush into right now. So I do welcome the fact that day by day we are getting closer to our European partners. Thank you, Sir Desmond.
Order. 1 minute limit. Rachel Maskell.
Swain, our duty in this place is to build bridges, not to build walls. And yet, since the Brexit vote, we have seen our country pull itself apart day by day because the disruptors which caused the Brexit vote have continued to disrupt our communities. And why is that? Because they've made our country poorer. They've regressed our economy. We've lost the jobs, and the very services are no longer supported in the way that they are. We have got to build our way back, and build our way back fast. And that's why rebuilding the relationships is the first step. But we must move forward, as so many have said, to a customs union, to the single market, and ultimately to our membership back in the European Parliament, being rule makers, not rule takers, as my city voted back in 2016, and my constituents 2/3 for remaining. It is why we need to come together and have a decision between ourselves as to that pathway to hope once again.
Order. Al Pinkerton, Liberal Democrat spokesman.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and I am very grateful to the honourable member for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry for securing this debate. In 2016, the British people were offered a vision of life outside the European Union built on easy promises. £350 million a week for the NHS, effortless global trade deals, and all the benefits of membership with none of the obligations. There was no detailed blueprint, no agreed destination, and no serious plan. And as the still comparatively new Member of Parliament for Surrey Heath, I'm acutely aware that my predecessor played a large part in leading us down that particular track. 10 years on, we're living with the consequences of those events. The National Bureau of Economic Research estimates that Brexit has suppressed UK GDP by between 6 and 8%, a loss equivalent to around £250 million a day. The trade deals struck with Australia and New Zealand amount to a fraction of 1% of GDP. They don't come close to compensating for the loss of frictionless trade with our largest and closest market, Europe. And I will, of course, give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. With the President of the United States threatening a 15% blanket tariff on all trade with the US, does my honourable friend agree with me that closer relationships with the EU should be absolutely top of our priority list?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her question. The capriciousness of the United States, I think, makes the case for closer economic cooperation with Europe all the greater. This is not abstract. Businesses up and down the UK are grappling with rules of origin paperwork, border delays and lost contracts. Investment is held back, productivity is squeezed, growth has slowed. But Norris is only about economics. 3/4 of young people voted to remain. A generation has lost the freedom to live, to work, to study across Europe. We withdrew from Erasmus+. We stepped back from the easy exchange of ideas and opportunity that strengthen our country. And at a time of war in our continent and growing geopolitical instability, stepping back from Europe has not made us stronger. It's left us more exposed. Now, the Liberal Democrats have always been clear. Britain's future lies at the heart of Europe. We are unapologetically pro-cooperation, pro-political and economic unions of all shapes and sizes, and pro-European. We believe that sovereignty in the modern world is strengthened by partnership. Pulling power with allies does not diminish Britain, it amplifies us. That's why we have proposed a new UK-EU customs union, a practical, deliverable step to rebuild economic partnership and provide certainty for British business, including those, I should say, in Northern Ireland. And last year, this House backed that approach in a vote that, for the first time in years, appeared to nudge the government into speaking seriously about rebuilding our relationship with Europe. A customs union would remove tariffs and rules of origin barriers, cut border friction, strengthen supply chains and support growth. It's neither the final destination nor the sum total of our ambition for the UK, however. And I draw the honourable member for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry's attention to our 4-point plan. But it is the next step in restoring a close economic partnership with the European Union and rebuilding trust with our largest trading partner. And that is absolutely essential in a low-trust environment created by the events of the last 10 years. Britain was and always will be a European country. Our prosperity, our security and our influence depend on recognising that fact. So this is not a debate about the past. It's not a betrayal of 2016, as some would have us believe. It's a test of whether we are prepared to act now in the national interest. It's time to be ambitious for the United Kingdom again. It's time to rebuild a serious partnership with Europe. It's time to deliver growth, widen opportunity and secure Britain's place at the heart of European economic, cultural and strategic life. Thank you.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. More than 7 in 10 voters in my constituency voted to leave. That wasn't an accident, it wasn't confusion, and it wasn't because they were lied to. And having spent 7 happy years working in the European Parliament, I wasn't unfamiliar with the EU's strengths, but also with its faults. But if there was one thing that caused me some hesitation before I decided to campaign for leave, It was knowing that it would be a huge undertaking, that unpicking 50 years of legislation and regulation would clearly be disruptive for many businesses, including many in my own constituency, that it would use up a lot of government time for at least a decade. And of course, a global pandemic, a once-in-a-generation energy crisis, and the shockwaves of war in Europe have added to that disruption. But to attribute every headwind to Brexit, as some members have done, may be politically convenient for some, but it would be economically simplistic. Some members have spoken about a £90 billion hit. Now, the reality is that since Brexit, UK GDP has grown at about the same rate as Italy and above that of France and Germany. So for that £90 billion to be credible, you would have to imagine that we would have vastly exceeded, no, I've only got 5 minutes, vastly exceeded the growth of every large European country, if only we'd stuck closer to what we're already doing, closer to the framework that those countries with lower growth are still in. And exports to the EU, as is, I will very quickly.
I think the honourable member down there had his say quite significantly. The EU is a failing entity and we got out just at the right time. Would you agree that it's the continued capitulation of this government and other UK parties to actually accept the democratic outcome that has led us to this point, especially the problems that we're experiencing in Northern Ireland? So it's not about joining the EU as a solution, it's a strong government leading this United Kingdom as a whole.
I mean, the issue the Honourable Lady raises is obviously an important one. Last summer, the Federation of Small Businesses in Northern Ireland said that 2/3 of SMEs in Northern Ireland, because of the way that EU checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain were being conducted, 2/3 of those SMEs that move goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland had ceased to do so. Now, the Northern Ireland Protocol does say that if the UK experiences diversion of trade, that we can take unilateral action. Now, if 2/3 of small businesses doesn't count as diversion of trade, then what does? Now, as the record shows, exports to the EU have grown by more, not less, in the 3 years since we effectively left the EU at the end of January. The 5 years. The 5 years since we left the EU in 2021, than it did in the 6 years before the referendum. Now, the opposition has set 5 clear tests for any renegotiation with the European Union. No return to free movement, no new payments to the EU, no loss of fishing rights, no dynamic alignment with EU rules, and no compromise on NATO's primacy in European defence. Those tests aren't ideological, they are the minimum requirement for respecting that 2016 mandate. Because dynamic alignment may sound technical, but it means accepting rules with no longer shape. Budgetary contributions may be dressed as programmes, but they mean sending money back without membership, often far more than can be fairly attributed to the cost caused by our own participation. And a customs arrangement that restricts our trade autonomy undermines the very sovereignty that voters endorse. Because Brexit was never about isolation, it was about independence, it was about being outward-looking on British terms. So we now have the ability to strike trade agreements globally. We've joined the CPTPP, helping to open access in markets in 11 high-growth economies, from Canada to South Korea to Australia. And many of the bilateral trade deals we have signed go far beyond the preceding EU trade agreements, with deeper digital trade and data chapters that are so important to so many of the sectors in which Britain is strongest. Financial market reform has reduced the risk margin for life insurers, meaning we can promote long-term growth and divert more to long-term infrastructure and green technologies. Whilst in agriculture, the UK has moved to environmental land management schemes based on the principle of public money for public good to support environmental outcomes instead of just paying landowners to own land. Our duty is clear: to honour the mandate, to defend the sovereignty the people voted for, to work with our allies as equal sovereign partners where we can, and to protect our country's ability to take its own decisions in our nation's interest.
Thank you, Chair, and can I thank the honourable member for securing the debate and the many other contributions today
from all sides of the House, all parts of the UK, if not quite from both sides of the referendum debate in the numbers of the result. But in the time I have, I want to cover some of the questions raised to the government's approach and reflect on the importance of this vote 10 years on. Because whichever side you were on, the Brexit result was the most significant and defining political moment of a generation, not just in terms of our relationship with the EU, but in reshaping our place in the world and challenging assumptions that we'd long held about our economic and trading relationship, our security relationship, our diplomatic power and reach, as well as the very ties and bonds that hold together this great United Kingdom of ours, in particular in Northern Ireland, and the huge challenges the referendum result has undoubtedly raised and were very powerfully brought up earlier. The referendum result also, of course, defined the political choices of the last decade, leading not just to the rise and fall of many prime ministers, but to gridlock in Parliament, and in my view, an overlooked consequence, that the big domestic reforms this country was crying out for, send, social care, planning, tackling inequality, became ignored because this Parliament and successive governments proved themselves incapable of doing Brexit and, frankly, anything else. That, I'm afraid I will not. That, I'm afraid, is the silent tragedy of the Brexit decade. It is a mistake we will not repeat. Now, a quick confession, Chair. At the time of the referendum, I was a youngish political advisor to the relatively new Member of Parliament for Holborn and St Pancras. The day after the referendum, I remember being sat in his garden discussing what on earth we would do next. Suffice to say, he was not best pleased with the result, but he did understand its significance, and as the honourable gentleman raised earlier, the importance of respecting that result and finding a way through. So after a short period of introspection, the now Prime Minister sketched out a vision of what he thought Britain should do. In time, this would become known as making Brexit work. It meant leaving and being outside the EU, but being close to it. It meant leaving in an orderly way, but minimising the economic, cultural and diplomatic dislocation that we all knew would follow. To cooperate where we can, protect British businesses, supply chains and employment standards, and as he mentioned many times in the House during these debates, to ensure no hard border in Northern Ireland. And so nearly a decade on, this Labour government was elected with a mandate to do precisely that. And last year, the Prime Minister hosted the first UK-EU summit, where we agreed the first stage in this, the common understanding and a new framework for UK-EU relations. I'm afraid I won't. I'm so sorry. That includes a new security and defence partnership, because as the Prime Minister said in Munich, there is no British security without Europe and no European security without Britain. It also includes, as members mentioned, an SPS agreement, where the Honourable Member for Cambridge made powerfully will make a huge difference to farmers and food producers. We're also in the process of negotiating access to the EU's internal electricity market, which will cut bills for businesses and consumers. And we're also negotiating the Youth Experience Scheme, the number of members mentioned, and something I strongly support and have called for. I'm also delighted that we've negotiated, and I think, by the way, quite quickly, to rejoin the Erasmus Plus scheme that will benefit over 100,000 young people. And, Mr Chair, we will legislate for this shortly, and we aim for these agreements to be implemented in the first half of to be in play by the first half of 2027. So the progress we've made in the last 18 months is the basis of that closer relationship the Prime Minister had in his mind's eye when we discussed this back in his garden some 10 years ago. And to be clear, and I say this proudly and confidently, this is just the start of a new relationship with the EU under this government. We are no longer, as the Prime Minister said at Munich, the Britain of the Brexit years. We want a closer relationship with the EU. We want deeper integration. We were elected with a mandate to do precisely that, and we will deliver that. It will, in line with our manifesto, be outside the single market, the customs union, and without freedom of movement. And we will not try to relitigate the referendum result. But we will repair the unnecessary national self-harm of the deals negotiated in the last decade. And we will align with the single market where it is in our national interest and in our sovereign right to do so. Mr Chair, we will deliver a partnership with the EU based on common economic, cultural and interest in the national interest, and to turn the page on the last decade of failure.
Gethings.
And a huge thanks genuinely to colleagues, and in particular the member for North Antrim, who did come along and represent one particular perspective. I'd like to thank the Minister. I do remind him, of course, that the Prime Minister voted for a European referendum on the EU in 2019. I do hope the Brexit Omerta is over, and I just remind the House gently that democracy is no longer a democracy when we no longer have the ability to change our minds. Brexit's been a disaster. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.